Disinformation knows no borders, and today the stakes seem higher than ever. Welcome to Truth Talks, a brave new podcast series tackling the challenges of fake news and propaganda head-on. Join us for engaging short conversations with experts from all EU member states and Ukraine as we uncover the truth behind dominant disinformation trends and explore the strategies shaping Europe's fight against manipulation. In this episode, we are zooming in on Hungary. Today in Budapest, our guest is Péter Krekó, Executive Director at Political Capital, a Budapest-based independent policy research, analysis and consulting institute. Welcome to Truth Talks.
Hi, Karolina. Thanks for having me in the show.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much. Hungary has been a hotspot for disinformation, with narratives often aligning with political interest. What are the key manipulative narratives being pushed now in Hungary?
Hungary have become in the last years a kind of informational autocracy where Orbán's main legitimacy and his ability to reproduce his political support in every 4 years and gaining 2/3 elections is mainly because he could concentrate the media landscape to an extent that his dominant narratives are having a huge impact on the public opinion. And I can tell you examples for that later. This dichotomy of war and peace with anyone in the West who is supportive towards Ukraine are depicted as the warriors who want to have the Third World War. So this is, I would say, the most dominant master narrative at the moment. And there is another one which is strongly related to that is about national sovereignty, so that anyone who is cooperating with, foreign institutions, who accept foreign funding, who also are part of some international networks, are threatening Hungary's sovereignty. And this is pretty ironic after a US election where the Hungarian government tried to do its best to provide campaign consultancy, to support political candidates through foundations, to organize CPAC in order to show up support for Donald Trump, and also to doing their best to weaken chances for re-election. So if anyone in European Union does not really respect other countries' sovereignty, that's definitely Hungary. Despite all that, as we approach the next elections in 2026, this sovereignist rhetoric is just getting stronger because the government wants to use it as a tool to crack down on its political opposition.
We can also theoretically look at it not as necessarily disinformation, but more of a kind of a disinterpretation. How would you comment that?
Yeah, it's an important remark. And I think that more and more we have to broaden our categories if we want to describe the word in a precise manner. What we used as a term in a project where we analyzed the political advertisements and the state spending on political advertisements before the 2024 EP elections, we use the term hostile narratives because hostile narratives are usually more broad than just pure disinformation. So you cannot fact-check every claim that a politician makes because not all of them are factual in the nature, but they have references usually to information that is distorted and deliberately inaccurate. So I think hostile narrative is maybe the best term to describe these narratives.
You mentioned kind of narratives that seem in a way strategic. So you even mentioned that they're overarching. What other narratives, maybe of little lesser scope, are used today in Hungary? Today meaning, well, nowadays, this year, most recently. Anything, for example, about migration, about European Union, about Green Deal and similar regulation?
Yes, I think the very typical narrative that exists all over in Europe, in the Eurosceptic camp, that the European Union is a club of pro-migrant politicians who wants to, impose strange gender habits on everyone in the European Union, supporting exchanging surgeries and gender ideology and so on and so on. And also the same politicians wants to, reduce our freedom to behave and consume as we want to, because they want to tell us what fuel we should use, where we should travel, what we should eat, and so on and so on. So this anti-gender, anti-green, and anti-migration identity is becoming very prominent. With my gut feeling is that also combined with with a very hypocritical freedom of speech argumentation, that you are censoring the free speech, and we can talk about that later why it's false, but that's something that makes, I think, this whole package quite powerful. So the alt-right and the far-right in whole Europe and the transatlantic world can depict itself as the warriors of freedom. So the authoritarian right, with its repressive tendencies, are posing as the warriors of freedom. And also in many sense, I think for liberals and ex-liberals, their argumentation pretty much fits, because they feel that these are the forces who defend the citizens from the oppressive state. And that's what I think both powerful and quite dangerous narrative that I do not think the democratic center have found any counter-argumentation for.
And what are the main actors shaping, creating, and or spreading disinformation in Hungary?
Hungary is a specific case because I would say the state is the biggest distributor of disinformation. In Hungary, for example, Russian narratives about the war are quite widespread. According to one of the polls that Political Capital made, more than 60% of the Hungarians think, for example, that the life of Hungarians in Transcarpathia, the part of Ukraine that previously belonged to Hungary and that still has a considerable Hungarian minority. So the lives of Hungarians in Ukraine are in immediate everyday danger. And it's simply not true, but this is a dominant view. Is it a dominant view because Russian propaganda outlets are so important and influential in Hungary that they can persuade the public? No, they can be widespread because Hungarian politicians, including the prime minister himself, including the state-owned media, including the huge media empire that consists more than 500 media outlets in a country of 10 million, it is parroting the same propaganda messages. And in Hungary, for example, if you want to hear about the US biolabs in the territory of Ukraine, you don't have to go to some kind of fringe websites. You can just switch on the TV, prime time, the public TV, and switch to the evening shows, and so-called experts will tell you that this is a reality. They will also tell you that Ukraine is preparing a nuclear weapon to attack Russia, and that's why Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, by the end of the day, according to their interpretation, is just an act of self-defense.
And how would you measure the vulnerability of Hungarian society to these disinformative narratives?
We have done quite a lot of public opinion polls, representative public opinion polls. We also have conducted one recently comparing Hungarian attitudes to Czech, Slovakian, and Bulgarian attitudes. And what we found, the results were quite shocking. We found that Hungarian population proved to be the most vulnerable even to pro-Russian narratives. And if you compare Hungary to countries like Slovakia and Bulgaria, where the traditions of pan-Slavism are much stronger, where there are language and cultural, historical relations to Russia, unlike with Hungary. And still, we could see that in Hungary, the Russian disinformation is just having a bigger audience and spreading more easily. So for me, it was rather an indication of that. I'm a social psychologist myself, and I do think that in many sense we put too much emphasis on history. History might be more important for historians than for the general public, and the experiences from Hungary shows that you can override the attitudes, the geopolitical attitudes of the population in quite short amount of time against historic experiences. Hungarian right have always posed as the, defender of Hungarian sovereignty from threats coming from the East. I mean, 1956, the revolution against the Soviet Union was always very emblematic element of the identity of the right. And also, and Hungary, Orban always tells that Hungary is the country of freedom fighters. And right now, Orban is in much closer relationship with Vladimir Putin that have posed an essential threat to Hungarian sovereignty historically than with Ukraine. So Fidesz voters have been the most anti-Russian when Orban returned to power in about 2010. Right now they have the most pro-Russian attitudes. And of course it's not isolated. We could see this shift in the United States. We could see this shift in other countries in Europe as well. But in Hungary, having the experiences we had, 2 of our freedom fights were broken by the Russians, and right now teaming up with Russia, I think it's quite dramatic that the voters of Fidesz have followed this shift without any rupture.
And what do you think is the intent of disinformation creators and spreaders on making this shift happen?
Brilliant question, because I don't think we have an easy response to that. So if we use Occam's razor, we can just argue that if you take a look at the public opinion polls and the electoral success of Fidesz, it's sufficient to explain the end goal of the whole game, to win elections again and again and again. And I think there is a truth to this narrative, in the sense that I think this narrative of some European politicians are just being puppets of Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping and so on is a bit overstretched. Until it helps them to win elections, why don't we think that they are just tactically, strategically teaming up with their allies so that they can win elections? In Hungary, and not just in Hungary, but in overall Central Eastern Europe, this so-called pro-peace narrative have proved to be a quite, I think, successful political product. Not in Poland, definitely, but in Slovakia, Fico was elected with that platform. Andrej Babiš, who most probably will soon return to power, has the same so-called peace message. And it works in Hungary as well. So I think it's important to see that it pays off domestically. But of course, I think it has a more broad picture than that. I think what Anne Applebaum well describes in his latest book, Autocracy Inc., the autocratic actors, some of them in the democratic world, like Viktor Orban, like Donald Trump, some of them in the autocratic world, like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, have some kind of strange alliances between them that does not reflected in official international cooperation, not always also reflected in bilateral relations, but autocrats tend to help each other via propaganda, via troll networks, via sponsored disinformation, via, hybrid warfare measures. So I think we have to reconsider a bit the term alliance, even in the sense that maybe NATO and anti-NATO is just not an accurate description of where the friendships and antagonisms lie in the world these days.
When you were describing the shift in the society of Hungary, in a way, more positive attitudes towards Russia, it shows to me another interesting or even fascinating turn, meaning the huge potential of the supply side of what politicians give the society versus in shaping the demand side. Because often social psychologists are pointing to the necessity of the existing latency in the society in order to make it shift their opinions. And here we cannot exactly say that there used to be a latency. You mentioned that the Hungarian society was very much anti-Soviet and anti-Russian, while now it turns towards the opposite side. How would you explain the change?
Thanks for pointing to that contradiction. I mean, I was quite busy beforehand in dealing with the demand side. We also, with my colleagues at Political Capital Institute, and we are still proud of that, invented an index called the Demand for Right-Wing Extremism Index that measured authoritarian, prejudiced, right-wing attitudes in the population and try to assess and try to even project and forecast the rise of the far right based on the attitudes. But we finally concluded that it's much more a supply-driven process. You can sell political ideologies like authoritarian right ideologies, and even in countries where you would think it does not have this strong demand. If you have good politicians having a lot of money, good infrastructure in the press, and so on, it can be absolutely sufficient. And I more and more think that the disinformation and spread of disinformation is also a supply-driven process and much less, demand matters less. And of course, which kind of narratives can spread in the population? I think there you have to adjust your narrative to the local audience. In Hungary, for example, this whole kind of peace narrative is something that very resonates, the elder populations who grew up in the so-called peace camp, in the Comecon world and in the Soviet-dominated world. Also, I think it has, Hungarian historic experiences, some reading of Hungarian historical experiences tells us that, okay, we are freedom fighters, but we got in many troubles because of we were freedom fighters, and all of our attempts for freedom were broken down. So it's better to be a bit wise. And it's the Kadarian rhetoric in Hungary, during the late Soviet era was also that, you can live a good life, just don't interfere into politics, don't interfere into geopolitics, and, be as silent as you can. And I think this kind of so-called peace narrative that let the big guys wage the wars and we have to left out of that is resurrecting this kind of, fearful, I would say rather covered attitudes that exists in the Hungarian society. And what I want to say is that, for example, if you would come here as, a US spin doctor and say that, UFOs will be the big topic. It's like extraterrestrials are just flooding the country and so on and so on. You would not be able to sell it. So I think there are limits to the supply side voluntarism of that you want to change the public opinion. But I think you're right that we usually overestimate the role of the historically shaped attitudes and how much they put a limit on what the politicians can do. If we take a look at the United States, for example, the Republican voters are much more pro-Russian in their attitudes these days than Democrats. Let's imagine it during the times of Ronald Reagan. Nobody could have imagined that.
Now I would like to ask you about the specificity, the uniqueness of the disinformation landscape in Hungary. How would you define it?
I think Hungary is unique in the sense that it has the most centralized media landscape. I think Silvio Berlusconi could have never even dreamed of a media empire that Orban has. Sometimes it really seems almost omnipotent in shaping the public opinion. And yeah, I mentioned already the attitudes. I would not say pro-Russian, but the anti-Western, anti-Ukrainian attitudes, how strong they have become as a result of the governmental propaganda. But let me tell you another example, the campaign against George Soros, for example. The campaign against George Soros that started in about 2015. It was not based on already existing negative attitudes towards Soros, who was rather an unknown positive figure in the Hungarian public opinion. He became a diabolic figure with very negative assessments, -80 in a scale of +100 to -100. So it's really negatively perceived figure, which means that the campaign had a huge impact beyond the Fidesz camp as well. So in the whole public was affected. Similarly, I think with the messages about Russia and Ukraine. Similarly with the campaign against migration. Yes, anti-migrant attitudes were strong originally in Hungary as well, but they were amplified very strongly by this governmental campaign. So the uniqueness of the Hungarian public opinion, I think, and the way how Hungarian campaigns work is that in a lot of cases, Orban is practically doing a monologue. and the public opinion listens to this monologue. And the opposition is either weak or they are afraid that because this is the dominant narrative that must be based on the public opinion, if they contradict that narrative, that they will be on the loser side. And I think what we face at the moment is a huge stress test for the propaganda machinery of Hungary, because there is a challenger, Péter Magyar, who according to the polls simply more popular than Viktor Orbán himself. His party is leading the polls, and it seems that the ability of this very centralized disinformation machinery that operates in Hungary to shape public opinion is simply not without limits. It's not omnipotent. And the government seems to lose the grand narrative on many issues. For example, that Hungary is just doing better than any countries in the European Union. I mean, there are too many statistics around that shows a quite different picture. And also there is finally an opposition leader who can really contradict Viktor Orbán in many of the economic and domestic political messaging. And I think his main message is that you are living much worse than the government claims you live, and corruption is much higher than you thought. And I think these are things that the Hungarians resonate to, but still we can feel how powerful the narrative framework that Orbán have become. Péter Magyar, for example, even if he is the member of the European People's Party, most hawkish group in the European Parliament, he's unwilling to challenge Orbán on most of the Russia and Ukraine related issues because he's afraid that he will become unpopular, because the majority is on Orbán's side. So when it comes to foreign policy, Orbán is still telling a monologue and everyone listens to this monologue.
So finally, so that we have any constructive, potentially positive aspect to our conversation, is there anything done, can anything be done in such a country as Hungary to tackle disinformation, to counter disinformation, and what more would you recommend?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Not to make the conversation too gloomy. I will try to come up with some optimistic note. First of all, I think there has been some real successful attempts to challenge governmental narratives, and not just from the political side that I already mentioned, from Péter Magyar, but just to say a recent example, there is a movie called The Dynasty. I would recommend it to every listeners to take a look. It's spread on YouTube, and it's Hungarian but with subtitles, and it's about the nepotistic empire that Viktor Orbán have built up, and it paints a quite detailed picture on how the relatives of Viktor Orbán have become rich as a result of the 15 years governance. It has been viewed by more than 3 million people already in a country of 8 million voters, and it's really popular. It will be a bit of advertisement. Political Capital is the head of a consortium called the Hungarian Digital Media Observatory that combines research on disinformation that I already talked about with fact-checking and with media literacy education. And of course, I mean, in a country like Hungary, sometimes we feel that we try to set off the fire with water pistol, but the success of Lakmus, our fact-checking partners that have teamed up with a quite popular online media platform called 444. So it had more than 2.5 viewers already. Again, in a country of 8 million voters, I think going against the very idea that fact-checking is always boring and nobody cares about fact-checking. If you use fact-checking in a more, sensational way, if you can come up with good clickbait fact checks, then many people will be interested. And according to figures, it can have also an impact beyond the already converted. So even some Fidesz voters are reading the fact checks of Lakmus, and I consider it as quite a success. And as I said, I'm with all the reservations I honestly have about the developments in Hungary currently, and with Orbán having a challenger that is also coming from the populist right, the dynamics in politics that finally appear, that it's not stagnating, but there is some movement, I think it creates quite a lot of opportunity for anyone who would like to challenge the grand narratives that Orbán wants us to live in.
Okay, thank you. Indeed, we managed to strike a more positive note in the end. And that brings us to the end of this conversation about Hungarian disinformation landscape. Peter, thank you for sharing these fascinating insights.
Thanks a lot, Karolina. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Truth Talk series is part of the project Guardians of Truth, fact-checking during Poland's EU presidency, which is supported by European Media and Information Fund, managed by Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation.